Kreislag in Todes Banden, BWV 4, is a cantata for Easter by German composer Johann Sebastian Bach, one of his earliest church cantatas. It is agreed to be an early work partly for stylistic reasons and partly because there is evidence that it was probably written for a performance in 1707. Bach went on to complete many other works in the same genre, contributing complete cantata cycles for all occasions of the liturgical year. John Eliot Gardiner describes it as Bach's first known attempt at painting narrative in music. Kreislag in Todes Banden is a chorale cantata, a style in which both text and music are based on a hymn. In this instance, the source was Martin Luther's hymn of the same name, the main hymn for Easter in the Lutheran Church. The composition is based on the 7 stanzas of the hymn and its tune, which was derived from medieval models. Bach used the unchanged words of a stanza of the chorale in each of the 7 vocal movements, in the format of chorale variations per omnes verses, and he used its tune as a cantus firmus. After an opening sinfonia, the variations are arranged symmetrically: chorus, duet, solo, duet, chorus, with the focus on the central 4th stanza about the battle between life and death. All movements are in E minor, and Bach achieves variety and intensifies the meaning of the text through many musical forms and techniques. Kreislag in Todes Banden is Bach's first cantata for Easter, in fact, his only extant original composition for the first day of the feast, and his earliest surviving chorale cantata. It was related to his application for a post at a Lutheran church at Mühlhausen. He later repeatedly performed it as Thomas Cantor in Leipzig, beginning in 1724 when he first celebrated Easter there. Only this second version survives. It is scored for 4 vocal parts and a Baroque instrumental ensemble, with a choir of cornetto and 3 trombones doubling the choral voices, a string section of 2 violins, 2 violas, and continuo. This exemplifies a 17th-century choral concert style. The lost scoring of the earlier performances was perhaps similar. Gardiner calls Bach's setting of Luther's hymn a bold, innovative piece of musical drama, and observes his total identification with the spirit and letter of Luther's fiery, dramatic hymn. Composition history. Background: Bach is believed to have written Kreislag in Todes Banden in 1707. He was a professional organist aged 22, employed from 1703 in Arnstadt as the organist of the new church. At age 18, he had inspected the new organ built by Johann Friedrich when he was invited to play one Sunday, and was hired. The organ was built on the 3rd tier of a theatre-like church. Bach's duties as a church musician involved some responsibility for choral music, but the exact year he began composing cantatas is unknown. Kreislag in Todes Banden is one of a small group of cantatas that survive from his early years. In Arnstadt, the cantor Heindorf was responsible for church music in the upper church, and the new church where Bach was the organist. He typically conducted music in the upper church and would appoint a choir prefect for vocal music in the new church. Wolff notes that subjecting his works to the questionable leadership of a prefect was not what Bach would have done. Therefore, most cantatas of the period are not for Sunday occasions, but restricted to special occasions such as weddings and funerals. Kreislag in Todes Banden is the only exception, but was most likely composed not for Arnstadt but for an application to a more important post at the Divi-Blassi church in Mühlhausen. Bach's early cantatas are choral concertate in the style of the 17th century, different from the recitative and aria cantata format associated with Neumeister that Bach started to use for church cantatas in 1714. Wolff points out the relation of Bach's early cantatas to works by Dietrich Buxtehude, with whom Bach had studied in Lübeck. Christ lag in Todes Banden shows similarities to a composition of Johann Pachelbel based on the same Easter chorale. Although there is no evidence that Bach and Pachelbel met, Bach grew up in Thuringia while Pachelbel was based in the same region, and Bach's elder brother and teacher Johann Christoph Bach studied with Pachelbel in Erfurt. Another of Pachelbel's works appears to be referenced in the early Bach cantata Nach dir Herr, Volonge Mich, BWV 150, and there has been recent speculation that Bach wanted to pay tribute to Pachelbel after his death in 1706. The texts for the early cantatas were drawn mostly from biblical passages and hymns. Features characteristic of his later cantatas, such as recitatives and arias on contemporary poetry, were not yet present, although Bach may have heard them in oratorios by Buxtehude, or even earlier. Instead, these early cantatas include 17th-century elements such as motets and chorale concertos. They often begin with an instrumental sinfonia or sonata. The following table lists the 7 extant works composed by Bach until 1708, when he moved on to the Weimar court. Bach uses the limited types of instruments at his disposal for unusual combinations, such as 2 recorders and 2 viol gamba in the funeral cantata Gottesdienst die Allerbestzeit, also known as Actus Tragicus. He uses instruments of the continuo group as independent parts, such as a cello in Nach dir Herr, Volonge Mich, and a bassoon in Der Herr denket an uns. The cantata for the inauguration of a town council is richly scored for trumpets, woodwinds and strings. Wolff notes the overall degree of mastery by which these early pieces compare favorably with the best church compositions from the first decade of the 18th century, proves that the young Bach did not confine himself to playing organ and clavier, but, animated by his Buxtehude visit, devoted considerable time and effort to vocal composition. The very few such early works that exist, each a masterpiece in its own right, must constitute a remnant only of a larger body of similar compositions. The Bach scholar Richard D. P. Jones notes in the creative development of Johann Sebastian Bach, his remarkable flair for text illustration is evident even in the early cantatas, particularly the 2 finest of them, the Actus Tragicus, BWV 106, and Christ lag in Todes Banden, BWV 4. We already sense a powerful mind behind the notes in the motivic unity of the early cantatas, in the use of reprise to bind the mosaic forms together. Readings and chorale. The prescribed readings for the feast day were from the first letter to the Corinthians and from the Gospel of Mark. The reformer Martin Luther wrote several hymns in German to be used in church services. His hymn, Christ lag in Todes Banden, was based on the Latin hymn Victimae Paschali Laudes, and first published in 1524. It became a main Easter hymn in German Lutheranism. The hymn stresses the struggle between life and death. The third stanza refers to the sting of death, as mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The fifth stanza relates to the Osterlamm, the Paschal Lamb. The sacrificial blood refers to the marking of the doors before the exodus from Egypt. The final stanza recalls the tradition of baking and eating Easter bread with the old leaven, alluding again to the Exodus, in contrast to the word of grace concluding, Christ would alone nourish the soul. Quote, In contrast to most chorale cantatas that Bach composed later in Leipzig, the text of the chorale is retained unchanged, which he did again only in late chorale cantatas. Performances. Christ Lag in Todes Banden survives in a version from the 1720s when Bach held the position of Thomas Cantor in Leipzig. There is documentary evidence suggesting that this Easter Sunday cantata was premiered in 1707. It is known that Bach performed a cantata of his own composition at Easter in 1707 as a part of his application for the post of organist of BWV Church in Mühlhausen, and this may have been Christ Lag in Todes Banden. By this time, Bach was already demonstrating ingenuity in keyboard music, as known from the early works in the Neumeister collection. Christ Lag in Todes Banden is a significant milestone in his vocal music. It was completed 7 years before his sequence of Weimar cantatas begun in 1714 with Himmelskönig, SEI Willkommen, BWV 182, and 17 years before he started a complete annual cycle of chorale cantatas in Leipzig in the middle of 1724 with O year.Kate du Donnerwort, BWV 20. Bach would have been attracted to Mühlhausen for its status as a free imperial city and its several churches and tradition of vocal music. Wolff notes that Bach possibly sent 2 other cantata scores with his application, and once he knew the date of the audition may have composed Christ Lag in Todes Banden in addition. A month after Easter, on the 24th of May 1707, an agreement was reached to hire Bach, who seems to have been the only candidate considered seriously. Bach performed the cantata again while Thomas Cantor in Leipzig, notably at his first Easter there on the 9th of April 1724. He also performed it the following year on the 1st of April 1725 in his second cycle of Leipzig cantatas, a cycle of chorale cantatas based on Lutheran hymns. It followed in the cycle some 40 newly composed cantatas. This early work fits the cycle in the sense that it is based on a chorale, but its style is different from the others. Music, scoring and structure. Bach structured the cantata in 8 movements, an instrumental sinfonia and 7 vocal movements corresponding to the stanzas of the hymn. The duration is given as 22 minutes. The title of the original parts of the first Leipzig performance is Feria Paschatos, Christ Lag in Todes Banden, A4, VOC, cornetto, 3 trombone, 2 violini, 2 viol, con continuo, die sign, Johann Sebastian Bach. In this late version, Bach scored the work for 4 vocal parts, alto, tenor and bass, and a Baroque instrumental ensemble consisting of strings, brass and continuo. The brass parts, a choir of cornetto and 3 trombones playing colleparti with the voices at times, may have been added in the 1720s. They may also possibly represent the original scoring, in the style of the 17th century polychoral tradition. The scoring of the cantata Christ Lag in Todes Banden has been described as archaic, and its style medieval. The string section consists of 2 violin parts and 2 viola parts. This indicates an older practice as for instance found in 17th century church cantatas by Bach's ancestors, and in Jesus Christus ist Amensvermisseter Willen Verwunde, a passion setting from the early 18th century which Bach had performed a few years after composing the cantata Christ Lag in Todes Banden. In the first half of the 18th century, the standard for a string section soon evolved to 2 violin parts, 1 viola part and continuo. The cornet used in the cantata was an instrument that belonged to an earlier age. By the second quarter of the 18th century it had almost entirely disappeared from Bach's compositions. There is relatively little distinction between choral sections of the cantata and sections for vocal soloists. One editor commented that the whole cantata may be sung as chorus. This compares to the clearer demarcation between choral movements and movements for vocal soloists in Bach's later works. However, the number of voices the composer intended per part remains somewhat contentious, and recordings of the work differ considerably in the configurations deployed. The harmony is often modal instead of the modern tonal system. In the following table of the movements, the scoring and keys follow the Neue Bach-Ausgabe. The keys and time signatures are taken from the book on all cantatas by the Bach scholar Alfred de, using the symbol for common time and allabreve. The continuo, played throughout, is not shown. Hymn tune. Luther's hymn is based on the 12th century Easter hymn, Todes Banden, which relies both in text and melody on the sequence for Easter. Victimae Paschali Laudes. A new version was published by Luther in 1524 and adapted by Johann Walter in his Wittenberg hymnal for choir, Eyn Geistlich Gesang Bachlein. A slightly modified version appeared in 1533 in a hymnal by Cluj. This chorale tune would have been familiar to Bach's congregations. Bach composed other arrangements during his career, including the two chorale preludes BWV 625 and BWV 718, and the Fantasia super Christ Lag in Todes Banden, BWV 695. Bach's organ works and the version in the cantata use the passing notes and regular rhythmic patterns of the 1533 version. Movements. Unlike in Bach's later cantatas, all movements are in the same key. The cantata begins with an instrumental sinfonia. The 7 stanzas are treated in 7 movements as chorale variations per omnis versus, with the melody always present as a cantus firmis. All stanzas end on the word Hallelujah. The symmetrical sequence of the 7 stanzas is a feature more often found in Bach's mature compositions. Chorus, duet, solo, chorus, solo, duet, chorus. The musicologist Karl Traubmann-Carl notes the variety of treatment of the 7 stanzas, while retaining the same key and melody. Polyphonic chorale fantasia, duet with walking bass in continuo. Trio sonata, polyphonic and imitative, woven around chorale melody, homophonic with elaborate continuo line. Duet, using trio sonata texture with extensive imitation. 4-part chorale setting. John Eliot Gardiner, who conducted the Bach cantata pilgrimage in 2000, calls Bach's setting of Luther's hymn a bold, innovative piece of musical drama, observing that Bach was drawing on medieval musical roots, and noting Bach's total identification with the spirit and letter of Luther's fiery, dramatic hymn. Bach could follow Luther's ideal in which music brings the text to life. Sinfonia. The cantata begins with an instrumental sinfonia, a work in the style of an overture to a contemporary Venetian opera, with chordal passages and occasional polyphony. It introduces the first line of the melody. The mood is somber, recalling the deathsbonds of the first line of the hymn, Christ's death on the cross and burial. The opening stanza, Christ lag in Todes Banden, is treated as a chorale fantasia. Without instrumental opening, the movement starts with the chorale tune sung by the soprano in very long notes. parts, with all other parts entering soon after the soprano begins each choral statement. The alto line is derived from the chorale tune, while the viola parts principally reinforce the alto and tenor voices. The violin parts are independent and, as Trautmann-Carr notes, further activate the texture with a virtually continuous exchange of 16th note snippets. The figure in the violins known as susurratio reflects Christ's suffering in the grip of death. The final Hallelujah is faster, giving up the fantasia format for a four-part fugue in motet style, with all instruments doubling the voices. The style of the movement recalls the 16th century style antico, although the style is still unmistakably Bach's. The second stanza, aria duetto, is a duet of soprano and alto, den Todd Niemann's Swingin' Kund, over an ostinato continuo. It deals with humanity helpless and paralyzed as it awaits God's judgment against sin. Bach has the music almost freeze on the first words, den Todd, and the word Gefang, and is marked by a sharp dissonance of the soprano and alto. In the Hallelujah, the voices imitate each other on long notes in fast succession, creating a sequence of suspensions. The third stanza, Jesus Christus Gott Sohn, is a trio of the tenor, two obbligato violins and continuo. The tenor sings the chorale melody almost unchanged. The violins illustrate first how Christ slashes at the enemy. The music stops completely on the word Nix. The violins then present in four notes the outline of the cross. And finally the tenor sings a joyful Hallelujah to a virtuoso violin accompaniment. Verses 4 Es war ein wunderlicher Krieg, der Tod und Leben rangen, is the center of the symmetrical structure. It is sung by the four voices, accompanied only by the continuo. The alto sings the cantus firmus, transposed by a fifth to B Dorian, while the other voices follow each other in a fugal stretto with entries just to beat apart until they fall away one by one. In the final Hallelujah, in all four voices, the bass descends nearly 2 octaves. Stanza 5, Hier ist das rechte Osterlamm, is sung by the bass alone, accompanied at first by a descending chromatic line in the continuo which has been compared to the crucifixes of the Mass in B minor, but changing to a dance-like passage of continuous eighth notes when the voice enters. For every line of the stanza, the bass sings a chorale tune, then repeats the words in counterpoint to the part of the tune repeated in the strings, sometimes transposed. Ruskin describes this, with its antiphonal exchanges between the singer and the mass strings. This setting sounds like a parody of a Passacaglia-style Venetian opera aria, vintage 1640. The bass sings the final victorious Hallelujahs, spanning 2 octaves. Sophien wir das Hohe Fest is a duet for soprano and tenor accompanied only by the ostinato continuo. The chorale is shared by the voices, with the soprano singing it in E minor, the tenor in B minor. The movement is a dance of joy. The word one is rendered in figuration that Gardiner finds reminiscent of Purcell. Bach incorporates the solemn rhythms of the French overture into this verse, reflecting the presence of the word fine in the text. It may be the first time that Bach used these rhythms. Verses 7 Bach's original setting of the final stanza, Wirs und Leben wohl, is lost. It may have been a repeat of the opening chorus. In Leipzig, he supplied a simple 4-part setting. Manuscripts and publication. The original autograph parts are kept in the Bach Archive Leipzig. They were copied from the lost autograph score by 6 scribes, 4 of them known by name, including the composer. A manuscript score by Franz Hauser, dating from c. 1820 to 1839, is held by the Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin, Preußische Kulturbesitz. It bears a comment on page 178, nach den auf der Thomasschule befindlichen, original, autographed Stimmen in Partage gebracht. LP D16. October 33. F. Hauser. The cantata was first published in 1851 as No. 4 in the first volume of the Bach-Gesellschaft-Ausgabe, edited by Moritz Hauptmann. Half a century later, a vocal score of the cantata appeared in Novello's original octavo edition, under the title Christ Lay in Death's Dark Prison. The piano reduction was by John E. West, and the translation of the cantata's text by Paul England. In 1905 this vocal score was republished in the United States by H. W. Gray. Henry S. Trinker's translation Christ Lay by Death Enshrouded appeared in a score edited by Arnold Schering and published by Eulenburg in 1932. In 1967, Schering's score edition was republished by W. W. Norton with an extended introduction and bibliography by Gerhard Hertz. Breitkopf and Amp Hartel, the publisher of the BWV, produced various editions of the cantata separately. For instance, in 1968 a vocal score with Arno Schonstadt's piano reduction and Charles Sanford Terry's translation. The new Bach edition published the score in 1985, edited by Alfred Durr, with the critical commentary published the next year. In 1995 Karas produced a revised edition of Hansler's 1981 Christ Lag in Todes Banden, edited by Reinhold Kubik. Both the Hansler and the Karas edition contained Jean Lund's Christ Lay in Death's Cold Prison translation. Karas followed the NBA's in Todes Banden spelling for the German title. In 2007 Karas republished the score edition with an introduction by Hans Joachim Schulze. Bach Digital, the published high-resolution facsimile images of the manuscript parts from the first quarter of the 18th century, and of an early 19th century score manuscript derived from these performance parts. Also in the 21st century, Serenissima Music published a vocal score of Christ Lag in Todes Banden compatible with Kalmus's performance material based on the BWV. Selected recordings. Christ Lag in Todes Banden was recorded early, and has been recorded often as of 2016. The Bach Cantatas website lists 77 different complete recordings, the earliest dating from 1931 when Louis Millet conducted the Orfeo Cantata in Francesc Pujol's Catalan version of the cantata. The performance was recorded by Levi Oz de Su Amo and appeared on 378 revolutions per minute discs. It was recorded twice under the direction of Nadia Boulanger, a 1937 version recorded in Paris and a 1938 version recorded in Boston. There are several recordings from the decades immediately after the war. Robert Shaw recorded the cantata in 1946 and again in 1959. Gunther Rahman conducted the Tom Maynard Shaw in 1950, the anniversary of Bach's death. The same year, Fritz Lehmann conducted the choir of the Musikhochschule Frankfurt with soloists Helmut Krebs and Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. Karl Richter and his Münchener Bach Shaw first recorded it in 1958. Nikolaus Harnoncourt recorded Christ Lag in Todes Banden in 1971 in a historically informed performance with original instruments and male singers. This was at the start of the first project to record all Bach's sacred cantatas. J.S. Bach das Kantatenwerk on Teldec. Christ Lag in Todes Banden has since been included in the other complete sets conducted by Rilling, Gardiner, Koopman, Lusink, and Suzuki. The entries in the following sortable table are taken from the listings by Arya Oren on the Bach Cantatas website. Some recordings rely on choir without solo voices, choirs with one voice per part, and orchestras playing on period instruments in historically informed performances are marked by green background. Transcriptions. In 1926, Walter Rummel published a piano arrangement of the cantatas fourth movement, Jesus Christus got sown. George Copeland recorded this transcription in 1938, and Jonathan Plowright recorded it in 2005, after he had recorded his orchestration of the chorale prelude Christ lag in Todes Banden, BWV 718, in 1931. Leopold Stokowski recorded his arrangement for symphonic orchestra of BWV 4's fourth movement in 1937. As chorale from the Easter cantata Christ lag in Todes Banden, the arrangement's score was copyrighted in 1950 and published by Brood Brothers. Later the arrangement was also recorded by Jose Cerebra and Robert Pigula. Recent performances. In 2000, the cantata was performed at Eisenach, in the church where Bach was baptized, as part of the Monteverdi Choir's Bach cantata pilgrimage. The Monteverdi Choir also performed the cantata in 2013 in the Royal Albert Hall. This performance, which had audience participation, was part of a 9-hour Bach marathon. The cantata was successfully staged by English Touring Opera in 2012. It was paired with the opera The Emperor of Atlantis and arranged by Ian Farrington for the same instrumental forces as the opera.